Hello and welcome to Gabbitt Media. I'm Gabbitt and today we're looking at the shop icon which I've made for the game Atlas Empires. A nice simple icon today, so I thought you might like to take a look and see how it was made. And you can find all the videos that I've done in the playlist in the description, along with videos about texture painting in this sort of stylized hand-painted way. There's also the links to Atlas Empires, the game. So it's a nice, easy, simple shape. As I've said, this is for an icon, so it's not actually in the game, even though I'm following the same sort of procedure that I would normally for any sort of low poly mobile game asset. I might go a little bit beyond the polys that I usually use, just because the visuals are more important than the actual poly count in this case. They wanted it 3D so they can easily move around the object and change the angles easily. And they could even animate the icons later on if they wanted to. It also follows that style that I've been doing all along, so they wanted to keep that sort of consistency across the game. You can see that I'm beveling the edges. That's something I wouldn't do so much of when I'm doing a mobile game asset, because you try and do as much as you can without such a high poly count. So all the edges and the shading should be done by your sort of hand-painted work that you do later on. So the sort of update to the game, or the full release of the game, should be some point this month. There is a version out at the moment, but it's sort of a beta version, and I'm really looking forward to the full release and seeing what it's going to actually look like with all the assets that I've made in there. So I try and keep everything really simple and basic. This is probably, again, a bit more high poly than I'd go, especially when adding a cylinder like this. I'd usually go a lot more low poly in terms of the vertices around the edges, but I'm just trying to get the look and feel right and using the proportional edit here to pull things into position. Mirroring objects where possible and duplicating objects where possible. I've got a solidify modifier on here, so I only have to do sort of one set of vertices. You can see that I'm doing it in separate shapes rather than all one model. It's often easier to do it like that, quicker, and it doesn't matter if shapes are interacting or intersecting with each other. It's not really a problem, especially when it's not going to be animated, as in rigged. For your characters, you might want to watch out for that and be careful. You can still do it in places. Common things are things like, I don't know, buckles or buttons or something like that that you don't really want as part of the main mesh, because you have to increase the poly count so much in order to incorporate them, but you might want them sticking out a bit. So you can see it's a pretty basic shape, nothing too complex, and it's something that most people can model. A lot of people get sort of concerned by the modeling aspect of this, but just keep it really simple, really basic, and concentrate on the painting, and that's where you get your real character and shading and highlights. So the unwrap process, again, nice and simple, and because they're separate objects, it's all pretty straightforward. I think, put them all onto one map in the end, which you would certainly do for most mobile assets. As this is an icon, I didn't worry too much about that sort of thing. But texture maps and texture sizes are really important for mobile games. So just going through, tidying things up, you can see my first initial unwrap was pretty bad, and just going around finding where the verts or the edges weren't marked as seams and so forth. So just spreading things out here as well. Again, I'm not tidying things up too much. I could do a better unwrap than this, but it's not really that important. Oh, and actually I did do two maps there, I forgot. One for the bow and one for the main box, which, as I say, you wouldn't do that normally with texture painting, although you can do that and then bake them all out onto one texture in the end. It is often better to paint on a larger texture to give yourself more pixels and then reduce it down for the game later. So the first thing to do with the texture painting is just to block out your colours. I think this is the point where I decided to separate the sort of ribbon going around the outside of the box, because it's just easier to select that shape and fill it in if it's a separate object, but it's not really going to make much difference here. It's purely for speed of workflow that I can select it quickly and then fill it in with a colour. So once again, tidying up the UVs, making sure they're all separate. I've noticed that when I unwrap, it doesn't give the same island margins all around, even though I've set the island margins. I'm not sure why that is. It tended to be fine for 2.79, but not for 2.8. Maybe I'm doing something wrong there. I have applied all my modifiers as well, so you can't really paint on or unwrap properly if you've got a solidify modifier on. So just blocking in the colours, the reds, and the sort of yellowy coloured box. It's not quite white, it's an off-white, which works quite well. When you've got something that's white, it tends to be a tough one to paint, strangely. Giving it a bit of colour, then you can put in the white highlights a bit more easily. Otherwise you end up with sort of greyish colours. It could even be a white box, but in a sort of yellowy coloured lighting environment, and maybe that's the best way to look at it. So as per usual, putting in the highlights and then putting in the shadow. It's all very straightforward really. You're kind of just painting in the ambient occlusion. And lots of people are saying, well, why don't you just bake in the ambient occlusion? It's never quite the same as when you go in and hand paint it. It gives it a sort of rougher, hand painted, textury look, whereas the ambient occlusion that you get from cycles, or well, just cycles in this case because you can't bake from Eevee, but the ambient occlusion you get from cycles isn't quite the same. It's realistic, but we're not going for realistic, we're going for stylized. You could use it as a base and a starting point. I don't find it too difficult to quickly paint it in, so the baking process is sort of a little bit laborious, and I just find it quicker and more relaxing to just sort of paint these things in. Ribbon materials are quite interesting. They've got a real sheen to them, so you have to go quite strong with your highlights, but you spread the highlight quite wide as well. So when I say strong, I mean close to white, but it's got quite a spread to it, and it's got an uneven spread as well. It sort of ripples across the surface. I suppose that's more the texture of the cloth and the way it bends and things. That's what I noticed from my reference images anyway. And it's quite good fun and a good challenge to take on different textures that you've not really done a lot of before. I suppose I've done it in things like flags and banners and things, but this was a real sort of shiny, satiny sort of look, and it's really good fun to have a go at those different textures. Now you may notice there's a bit of a mistake there. One of the ribbon pieces coming off here, or the tails or whatever you might call them, has not been unwrapped properly, and I just go back to that later and unwrap it. I'm just kind of finishing off the other bits first, and then I'll find a space on my texture. If I had really tightly packed my textures, then I would have to re-unwrap them and bake these textures from one object to another. It's a real pain, and I do like to have a tiny bit of space around the place on my texture map if I need to use any of those areas. I can readjust other areas that I haven't already painted as well, but I come to that in a moment. It is nice to take your time with these things. I know there's a deadline when you're working for a client, but to rush these things can be quite detrimental really, and you come up with sort of sloppy work, and you really need to take your time, keep looking at your reference images, and take the odd break here and there to come back to your image. If you can, work on something else and then come back to it is a good way to work. So all this shading that's under the bow and the lighting effects, that is all hand painted, and you just generally sort of build it up where you expect the light to hit and the dark spots to offer shade. And now I've unwrapped that ribbon sort of piece there, and now I can correctly shade it and light it. There's something very enjoyable and relaxing about hand painting. You can just sort of sit back and just tinker away at these pieces. It's a very enjoyable job to have really. And I have actually finished all the work now for Atlas Empires, so my part and role in the project is now really over. I suppose there's just a few tidying up bits every now and again that I'll get messaged and asked to complete and update, or maybe change slightly. I'm hoping that the game will be a big success and there'll be updates and all sorts that I'll need to be involved in. That would be really great, and look forward to any of that. We'll see how we get on. So there we have it, a nice simple shop icon. You can see that I didn't paint the very last bit on the back, and that's really because it's not going to be seen. If they need that updated, I can easily go in and just adapt that slightly. Do let me know in the comments any thoughts you have, and as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.